Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, a retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, the Universal Order. We are reading from chapter 14. Shukadeva explains Bharat's analogy. Mukam karoti vachalam pangum langayate girim yat kripatamam vande Shri Gurum Deenatarinam Paramananda Madhavam Shri Chaitanya Ishwaram Hari Om Tat Sat. Verse 17 to 19. Despite all this, the bewildered soul somehow imagines he is happy, like one in a dream. For example, sometimes he imagines a parent or grandparent has been reborn as his child or grandchild. Finding happiness in material life is hard, like climbing a mountain. As Bharat said, the wedding of one's children is just one of many expensive and troublesome social expectations incumbent on families. People struggle to arrange and pay for such functions. Family attachment is so strong, however, that despite all difficulties, people persevere. If he fails, he takes his frustration out on his loving spouse and children. Later, he suffers even more because of his regrets. Verse 20. Bharat then spoke about how the python of sleep swallows the conditioned souls. Conditioned souls. While asleep, a person forgets his responsibilities. This is also true in spiritual sense. Even though apparently awake, men are asleep to their real duties and life's spiritual aim. Like dead bodies lying in a lonely forest. Sadness crossed Parikshit's noble features. Practically all men were asleep to life's supreme goal of knowing Krishna. He prayed that Shukadeva's teachings would soon reach them. Verse 21, the sage continued. Bharat then described how snakes attack the traveler. This illustrates how the conditioned soul is deeply afflicted by the harsh words of his enemies, who connive to demean him. They are like envious serpents who bite him. He becomes so disturbed that he cannot sleep. He gradually loses all intelligence, and his confusion is like a blind man fallen into a dark well. Parikshit shook his head. Why do these poor souls not surrender to Krishna? So this is the obvious query from Parikshit Maharaj. Verse 22, Shukadeva said, they are irresistibly attracted to sex. They will take any risk for the sake of attractive women. Sex is the sweet taste that allures their living entities and keeps them trapped in material world, material existence. To enjoy this, a man will even rape or kidnap women, and therefore he suffers in this life and the next. Parikshit marveled at how people could waste the great opportunity of human life simply to pursue the animalistic pleasure of little sex, even though it was beset by misery. Even legitimate sex life was attended by so much difficulty in the shape of children and household duties. He sighed. Verse 23, understanding Parikshit's mind, Shukadeva said, a learned person who has transcended the illusion of material existence therefore condemns the path of karma or worldly enjoyment, knowing it to cause suffering in this life and the next. Bharat described those miseries by the analogy of fierce weather, said Parikshit. Verse 24, Shukadeva said, yes, the traveler afflicted by the elements is like men being cheated and robbed by others. Conditioned souls are constantly cheating each other to secure wealth, but no one can hold on to the money. I may trick you for your wealth, then another man, let us say Devadatta, cheats me and steals it. Then another man, let's say Vishnumitra, cheats Devdatta of the money, it passes from one cheater to another, and ultimately none of them can permanently enjoy it. Money is a manifestation of Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune. She is always Narayan's property. Parikshit said, so the right way to use wealth is in Narayan's service. That is the best way to use it. Replied Shukadeva, but still we cannot hold on to it. Ultimately, death, which is Narayan's agent, will take away everything. Parikshit peered out toward the darkened assembly of sages. Were they all convinced? Looking back at Shukadeva, he said, Master, some would say this is the pessimistic view of material life. Verse 25, not at all, said Shukadeva. Even in his so-called happiness, the materialist suffers the threefold miseries. Parikshit nodded. He knew that these were adidaivic suffering arising from natural disturbances, adhyatmic suffering arising from one's body or mind, and adhibhautik sufferings inflicted on us by other living entities. Bharat alluded to these miseries, said Shukadeva. Try to understand, no one can counteract them. They may all attack at once or at different times, but one or another will always be there. There is no escape. Thus the conditioned soul is always anxious. This is the truth. Parikshit said, it is not an exaggeration to say that living entities are always cheating each other. Verse 26, Shukadeva shook his head. Even in ordinary transactions, there is often cheating. It is inevitable because the conditioned soul has 4 defects: illusion, mistakes, imperfect knowledge, and the propensity to cheat. Even if we do not intentionally cheat our friend, we will make a mistake and they will feel cheated. In this way, so-called friends can fall out over a farthing or less. No matter how virtuous a conditioned soul considers himself, if he is sufficiently in need of money, he will probably resort to deceit. Along with the Verse 27, along with the difficulties already mentioned, the materialist experiences problems even from his so-called enjoyment, what to speak of from feelings of attachment, hate, fear, false prestige, illusion, madness, lamentation, bewilderment, greed, envy, enmity, insult, hunger, and thirst. Then there are the major problems of birth, old age, disease, and death. These insurmountable sufferings combine to give the materialistic man nothing but pain. How does enjoyment cause suffering? Asked Parikshit. You have always controlled your senses, but materialists overindulge and then experience a painful consequence. For example, excessive eating of rich foods causes indigestion and various other problems. Too much sex causes sickness. These are just a couple of examples. Parikshit said, earlier you attributed all of men's material miseries to sex life. How is that? Do not celibates also suffer? Verse 28, yes, renunciates are not immune to miseries, but at least they're working to solve the problems of life. When a man becomes bewildered by a woman's beauty, he loses his intelligence. He forgets that the goal of life is to get out of material existence and return to Krishna. Abandoning his spiritual practices, he becomes absorbed in providing his wife with all amenities, infatuated by the talks, glances, and activities of his wife and children. His spiritual knowledge is covered and he becomes immersed in the bodily conception, thinking his family and possessions belong to him. Parikshit had seen this many times. Not all men lost their good sense, though some practiced spiritual life at home with their wife and children, but this was the exception, not the norm. He said, do such people never try to solve the actual problem of life, birth, death, old age, and disease? Verse 29, Shukadeva said, do you remember that Rahugana said, what Rahugana said about the merchant in the forest taking shelter of herons, vultures, and cows? Yes, I do. When the merchant hears the roar of the lion, he sometimes takes shelter of such creatures. The lion represents death, and these birds represent false gurus. Exactly, let me explain more. Krishna's personal weapon, the Hari Chakra, is also the wheel of time. Hari Chakra encompasses all the measurements of time from the smallest to the lifetime of Brahma. Its spinning diminishes the lifespan of everyone in the material world, from Lord Brahma to a blade of grass. By the unstoppable motion of time, every living entity goes through the different stages of life and finally dies. Sometimes, when the conditioned soul is fearful of death's imminent approach, he worships someone who he thinks can save him. Unfortunately, even then, instead of taking shelter of time's master, Lord Krishna, the conditioned soul seeks help from self-proclaimed false gods and concocted scriptures. Bharat compared these cheating so-called gods to the scavenger birds. None of them can save one from the attack of all-devouring death. Parikshit said, Krishna also proclaimed himself to be Supreme Lord, so how can we tell if such a self-proclamation is true or false? This is a good question, my dear king. The Vedas mention all genuine incarnations. Verse 30. These false yogis who pose themselves as gods are actually godless atheists. Being misled themselves, they cheat their followers. They do not know how to make genuine spiritual advancement. Sometimes their disciples realize they are being cheated and turn to genuine Brahmins or devotees. Unfortunately, they often find it hard to follow the prohibitions against illicit sex, intoxication, gambling, and meat eating. Then they turn to low-class men who pose themselves as holy men while acting like monkeys by having sex with many partners. Such men posing as sadhus are the lowest types of Shudras who are ignorant of life's goal. They encourage each other in sense gratification, oblivious that their brief lives will soon end and they will fall into the lower species. Verse 32. Bharat's example of the monkey actually describes all conditioned soul. Just as a monkey jumps from tree to tree, the conditioned soul jumps from body to body. As the hunter captures a monkey and places it in captivity, similarly, the living being allured by sex pleasure becomes caged in family life. Parikshit said, no one has to remain in family life. Why do you compare it to imprisonment? Attraction to momentary sex pleasure is a shackle stronger than any lock and chain. It keeps the living entity fettered both in family life and material existence. How does the poor soul end up in such a mess? Verse 33, Shukadeva said, the problem starts when he forgets his relationship with Krishna. The pure soul loves Krishna and strives only for the Lord's pleasure. If he turns from Krishna and tries to enjoy independently, he commits sin and subjects himself to all kinds of misery. When he gets notice of death, he becomes fearful. Bharat compared this to being confronted by an elephant and falling into the mountain cave. Verse 34, prior to death, the conditioned soul is constantly suffering from many miseries arising from the natural disaster, his own body and mind and others' actions. Unable to counteract these difficulties, he becomes depressed. Bharat explained all of this to Rahugana. Verses 35 to 37, sometimes he borrows money from a friend or goes into business with him. Usually this leads to enmity because of one cheating the other, or even a small profit. Sometimes he loses all his money and becomes homeless, or if he keeps a roof over his head, he can hardly afford to buy household paraphernalia. People in general and even family members and previous friends then disrespect him. Desperate to change his circumstances by any means, he resorts to thievery. If caught, he is further insulted and punished and becomes even more unhappy. Even husbands and wives will deceive one another and end up separating. Verse 38, in summary, Bharat's point was that life in the material world is full of miseries. Sometimes the living entity may feel he is succeeding, and at that other times it is obvious he is not. Either way, he is always in a precarious situation, and things can go drastically wrong without warning. For example, everything seems to go fine in someone's life, and then suddenly his father dies, and he is plunged into grief. After a while, he forms a new attachments to his spouse or children, but material life is full of unexpected upheavals. Sometimes people are oblivious to this, and at other times they are anxious. Sometimes they weep, and at other times they laugh and sing, but they are never truly happy. Caught in this morass of competing feelings, the living entity forgets that he once enjoyed a loving relationship with Krishna. For those who know the truth, take shelter of Krishna in all circumstances, and escape from this dangerous material world. Only by hearing about Krishna it is possible to get out of the cycle of birth and death. Bharat was emphasizing that no one can ever be happy in material life. The only solution is to take shelter of Krishna by associating with the pure devotees. Verse 39, yes, this is the only way. You pointed out that even when people try to take shelter of devotees, they can be misled by cheaters. How can they find a genuinely saintly person? Real saints are friendly toward every living entity without exception. They are peaceful because they control their senses and minds. By hearing from them, one develops similar qualities and easily traverses the path of liberation. Unfortunately, because of the excessive attachment to the meager enjoyment of miserable material existence, the conditioned souls never seek the association of such saintly devotees. Pariksha thought again of the Karma Mimamsa philosophers. Would they still harbor misconceptions? He said, Is it not Vedic sacrifice to be helpful for spiritual success? Verse 40, not necessarily. Throughout the history of the world, there have been many powerful kings, learned in scripture and expert in performing sacrifice. Yes, despite their opulence, learning, and power, they could not attain Krishna's loving service. For that, you must give up the false ego or the notion that you are the material body and that everything associated with the body is yours. Often the material success results from sacrifices. Sacrifice makes it hard to relinquish one's false ego. Parikshit said, does learning and sacrifice not give them any spiritual advantage? Shukadeva said, regretfully, powerful leaders are often not interested in spiritual advancement. Preoccupied with increasing their power and fame, they create enmity with the rival groups, fights and fight and die without discharging life's mission. Bharat also made this point to Rahugana. Verse 41, do you remember, he said, the merchant holds on to the creepers. Parikshit nodded, yes, the creepers represent our past and present karmic activities. That's correct. Vedic sacrifices are meant to secure our elevation to the highest status of life. By performing them, one can rise to the highest material planets where there is no suffering, but this is not permanent liberation. When your pious credits expire, you fall again to the lower planets. If the conditioned soul remains attached to Vedic sacrifices, he continually goes up and up. Thus, this is not an actual solution to suffering. The only way to end the struggle of material existence is to take guidance from Krishna's pure devotees. This is the path Bharat recommended to Rahugana. My dear Parikshit, we should heed Bharat's advice. He is such an exalted person that ancient sages composed a verse comparing him to Garuda, Krishna's personal carrier. Verse 42, it goes like this: just as a fly cannot even in its imagination soar up along the path of Govinda, no other king in this world can even mentally follow the path of the royal sage Bharat, the noble son of Rishabh. Parikshit said, I am confused that the sages say no other king followed the same path as Bharat. Did not many great kings such as Priyavrata renounce everything to attain Krishna? Verse 43, the difference between Bharat and other kings like Priyavrata is that the Bharat gave up his family and kingdom while he was in the prime of his life, whereas Priyavrata and Atar renounced in old age. Bharat's desire to serve Krishna was so intense that even though he had a devotional wife, children, and close friends and a vast empire, he gave up everything to attain Krishna. This is extremely difficult, but because of the because of his intense devotion to Krishna, he did so unhesitatingly, just as one walks away from the stool after evacuating. Verse 34, without a doubt, Bharat's example is extraordinarily wonderful. No one else can emulate him. Not only did he give up his family and kingdom, but he left behind his wealth, which was so immense that even gods he renounced everything because of his powerful attraction to Krishna's incomparable beauty and opulence. Indeed, for a devotee who attains Bharat's standard of bhakti, even liberation from birth and death is inconsequential. So indeed, for devotees who attain Bharat's standard of bhakti, even liberation from birth and death is inconsequential. Parikshit said, yes, he took his next birth as a deer. How was that exemplary? Verse 45, because even as a deer, he did not forget Krishna, replied Shukadeva. This is the proof of its extraordinary devotion. Even as he was dying in that body, he composed a lyre glorifying Krishna. He composed a prayer while he was still in a deer's body. Parikshit looked astonished. Yes, replied Shukadeva, he prayed, I offer respects to the personification of sacrifice who protects religious principles. He personifies the mystic yoga process. He is the source of all knowledge and controller of the material creation and the super soul in every living entity. He is beautiful and attractive. I offer my obeisance to him, hoping that I may perpetually engage in this transcendental loving service. Verse 46, my dear Parikshit, King Bharat is so exalted that one is blessed just by hearing and talking about him. Krishna's devotees regularly do this because they know of its great benefits. Do non-devotees get any benefit from hearing about Bharat? Everyone will attain all his desires by hearing and chanting about all the auspicious King Bharat increases one's life and material experience. One cannot become frustrations. One can become famous and easily attain promotion to the heavenly planets, or if one prefers, he can merge into the King Bharat increases one's lifespan and material opulence. One can easily become famous and attain promotion to the heavenly planets, or even if one prefers, he can merge into the impersonal Brahman. You can attain anything you desire to discussing. One can become famous and easily attain opulence. One can become famous and easily attain promotion to the heavenly planets, or if one prefers, he can merge into the impersonal Brahman. You can attain anything to desire. You can attain anything you desire by discussing King Rebirth pastime. By this simple practice, you can fulfill all your material and spiritual classes. You do not have to approach anyone else for anything. So this brings us to the end of chapter 14. Next time we will start chapter 15, King Priyavata's descendant. Tomorrow is Radhashtami. Wish everyone who is observing Radha Ashtami and perhaps keeping fast as well a very happy Radhashtami for tomorrow. Ariyam Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.